Hello, and welcome to Mount Royal's celebration of International Women's Day, hosted by the Faculty of Business and Communication Studies with Women's Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub. My name is Dr. Rachael Pettigrew, and I'm an associate professor in Bissett School of Business in the Department of General Management and Human Resources. I'm thrilled to be able to moderate this discussion today. But before we begin, and as part of our commitment to reconciliation and decolonization, we want to acknowledge that Mount Royal University is located in the traditional territories of the Niitsitapi, the people of Treaty 7 region in Alberta, in southern Alberta, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, the Îyârhe Nakoda. We are situated on the land where the Bow River meets the Elbow River. The traditional Blackfoot name for this place is called Mohinskis, which we now call the city of Calgary, and is also home to Métis Nation. As a 10th generation settler, I acknowledge my inherited responsibility resulting from the impacts of colonization and acknowledge the historical and ongoing injustices facing Indigenous peoples. I am committed to, in collaboration with Indigenous peoples, to continue to learn, listen, and do my part in opposing injustice in all its forms. And I encourage you all to do the same. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your knowledge and experience with students and recent alumni. Today, we're going to be discussing allyship on the path to gender equity, and we're thrilled that you're here. It's going to be a great discussion. So I'm going to introduce all the panelists, but for more detail, their full bios are on the International Women's Day website. So here with me today, I have Elleen Clearsky. She is an assistant professor, faculty development consultant in indigenization here at MRU and a PhD candidate. And she is a descendant of the Anishinaabe, originally from Treaty 4 in Manitoba. And her passion has been to incorporate Indigenous knowledge into her teaching methods. So thank you, Ellen. Anna, based in Calgary, she is an advocate for 2S LGBTQ2+, and women's issues, and leader on diversity and inclusion, and so many volunteer and community contributions in addition to that. Eric Arthrell, joining us from Ontario, is the co-founder and CEO of Moosh Inc. and previously held roles in EDI at Deloitte, and while there authored a report called The Design of Everyday Men. And Shifrah Gadamsetti is a research intern at Summa Strategies, sits on the board of directors at YWCA, and is a regular political commentator on CBC Calgary, and also a graduate student right now. So, and probably about 10 or 15 more things on that list as well. So everyone, thank you so much for being here. As we chatted about before, the audience for this event is current MRU students and recent alumni. And so we're talking, this year's theme for the overall event is gender equity in the workplace. In our panel today, we're going to be narrowing in on allyship. It was something that the students on our planning committee were really wanting to learn more about, have a better understanding of. And so we thought we would create this discussion today. So now we're going to dive right in. So I'm going to start with Elleen. When I say allyship, what first comes to mind for you?
I think, first of all, I really appreciate you doing the land acknowledgement. I mean, that's a huge step towards building relationship with Indigenous people. That's part of allyship, is understanding the history of our people, but also understanding your positionality in terms of where you sit within the spectrum of Canadian society. For myself, as an Indigenous woman who has lived, born and raised in Canada, First Nations member, my positionality has changed and evolved over time because as history has shown, many of our people have been colonized, and that colonization has taken away our identity. Mm-hmm. And for me, this process of understanding what that means to me as an individual, as an Indigenous woman, has been a lifelong journey. And I believe that we're all on that path to understanding how do we build relationships with each other, and how will we communicate to each other in a good way so that we're all on the same page in terms of understanding what it really means to be an ally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's almost like we need to understand ourselves first before we can, in our position and privilege, before we can really step out and do the work.
Definitely. And that's a lifelong journey. But I mean, I think that the important step is to start, to understand your history, your people, your community prior to coming to Canada, because that positionality informs the work that we're doing today and why we need to work as a collaborative group as opposed to, some, organizations or people becoming factions against each other. We need to work together because we're trying to, have a mutual understanding of, we're all on this boat together. We're all trying to do this work together in a good way. And we can't do that if we don't even understand who we are and who we represent and why it's important to each one of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what I'm hearing you say is that both on one hand, trying to certainly understand oneself, right? And then also kind of taking blinders off for others to realize the positionality or even the position of privilege they have in order to be an ally in an effective way. I'm going to open it up to the group. When I say ally, what's your response? What do you think when I say that? Or what do you think an ally is?
I guess very simply, I would say that an ally is someone who doesn't make your life any harder. Yeah, even though they don't occupy maybe the same space and identity as you might, and they come from a place of understanding and seeking, more knowledge and like relationship building rather than active participation sometimes, rather than jumping right in. I'll let Anna go ahead. And maybe
Anna, go ahead.
To me, an ally is someone who walks alongside you on the path. It's someone who, is there as you walk towards, if you're the individual who faces any kind of marginalization in our society, who has privilege, that person with privilege comes alongside and extends a hand to help you get to a greater space of equity and inclusion.
Mm-hmm. Eric, any thoughts from you on that?
Yeah, I would just add that I think it's probably already been mentioned, is an ally is someone that does the work to understand. And I think that involves learning, that involves being aware of your own shortcomings or your own blind spots maybe, and doing the work to address those in sort of the service of others around you. And so, yeah, I would add that.
Yeah. And I think for young students and new grads to realize that work is never done. So that learning isn't like, oh yeah, I took that one class, like I know what I need to know now. That work isn't done. We continue to have to learn, and as even groups and terminology evolves and all of that learning needs to continue, right? So I'm going to move to you, Shifrah. And I know that when we hear the term ally, which we've just talked about, we know that allyship can be problematic too. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between real allyship and performative allyship, and maybe how do we address it if it's not going well?
Right. Well, I think like you really have to sort of take a step back. And maybe, I'll reframe my statement, because what I'm going to say is really about my own personal experience, right? So when I've been in a position where I am seeking to be an ally, and I say that very intentionally because I'm seeking to do that, but it doesn't mean I'm necessarily being successful at it. It comes from a place of like help and like wanting to help and have empathy, but also understanding that I might not be in the best position to be offering that. And that doesn't mean that automatically I've removed myself from being an ally, but I think, being an ally is equal parts doing the work, like Eric said, but also recognizing that the work is sometimes just holding back and saying like, this is not the time for me to step in, because I might not know everything I need to know about the situation. I haven't done my learning. Like I might not be the best person to help in this scenario. And I think that that pulls away from that performative nature or that like savior complex, which I think a lot of us, including myself, are drawn to without even realizing that that's happening, right? And so I think it's doing the work, but understanding that the work is sometimes so internal before you even engage with somebody else. So if it comes to, you know, issues of culture, like what are you doing to understand before you enter the space? Like what are you doing to understand the lived experience of somebody else from a different, you know, sexual minority or sexual gender orientation from you, before you seek to enter that space? Like, is this the right time to speak up? Because there are absolutely times where as an ally you will have positions of privilege, right? And this doesn't exclude certain people. We all have different aspects of our identity, and no one person is sort of removed from this process. And when you are in a place where, you know, you have a position of power, or you know that you're not going to face consequences in the way that somebody else is while you're observing harm, sure, step in. But even if you're going to do that, I think it takes a lot of work to sit back and say, okay, do I know what I need to know about entering this conversation? Like, is it necessary for me to enter that conversation? And I think it's been like a really great learning experience for me to always reframe my allyship in that way, because I realize every single time that I don't know what I don't know. So there's just so much going on, you know, and when you do take that step back, you're able to sort of see the bigger picture. Like, are there people already doing what it is that you want to do, even once you feel like you're better engaged or you're more knowledgeable about the circumstance? And it's just like an ongoing journey. It's piqued my curiosity. You know, I think it's also really important to frame allyship that way, because it pulls away from guilt as a motivator, and really like works towards compassion and empathy and understanding, like how our relationships with each other sort of connect, right? Like where you find common ground, what it is that you have to offer, what you're willing to make space for.
Yeah, and I think there's a direct line between when we're having that conversation with what Elleen was saying around kind of understanding oneself. Because when I think of, for example, we, you know, in the land acknowledgement, we addressed truth and reconciliation, but the big part of that is actually the truth, right? We can't move on and take action until we understand and have learned and have done the work. And so, you know, drawing connections between the two things that you were saying is like really taking a step back, understanding, learning, acknowledging, and then from an informed space, taking action, right? So, and I think perhaps that might be a way of reducing harm in that, the intent of allyship, right? Anybody else, does that ring? I'm trying to think of, when we're thinking about allyship in the workplace, how can people be effective allies in situations in the workplace if we're seeking gender equity? Say there's an exchange that is fairly sexist. Like, what does good allyship in that situation look like? And I open that up to anybody.
I'd actually like to go back to the discussion around the classroom, because I've had experience, you know, when I've had to deal with uncomfortable conversations around, you know, certain topics. And I've found that, you know, when we have a group of students that are really not understanding or having fear to say anything, that prevents them from being, excuse me, hang on. That prevents them from being an ally or even initiating discussion, because of, I'm not too sure what it is when the student comes into the classroom and if it gets heated discussions around different topics, it's really sometimes some of them are very fearful of speaking up, and I'm not too sure why. Mm-hmm. I don't know the history of that, you know, what's going on, but maybe they're experiencing the same thing as I am. I don't know, but I find that students feel uncomfortable. And I think for me as an instructor, my goal has always been to try and support the students when we have these heated discussions around various topics that really are very uncomfortable, but just providing a safe space for them so that they know that, you know, what goes on in the classroom stays in the classroom. That's my hope.
Yeah.
So the way that I've designed my courses was through sharing circles, and there's protocol around that, and how we, when we share stories, it stays within that space, and it's not a time to gossip about, different aspects of our discussion. So that's one way that I've tried to help support students when it becomes too difficult to speak about certain topics. So, and to me, that's my way of showing the students that I'm there to support them, but I'm also modeling for them. This is how they can do it too when situations become difficult, or if they just want to have a discussion.
Mhm.
So that's kind of how I've seen things within my own experience at the university teaching. And I find that some students are fearful of speaking up.
Yeah.
So how do we move from fear to action? That's the, I guess that's the question to consider.
Yeah. That makes me think of an academic term in the business world, which we're hearing a lot about these days, which is psychological safety. So companies or employers want people to be able to show up as they are and be themselves and all of that. And when I hear that, I believe in it. I mean, I do think there's spaces are better when people don't have to show up and hide a portion of themselves. But I also think that there's times when they shouldn't show up as themselves because they will face discrimination or pushback and things like that. Shifrah?
This actually just like makes me think of maybe it's like a preemptive cultural change in the workplace, because we're talking about that. I actually first started doing this with like not me myself, but like our board. Folks who are interested in watching more than one panel today can check out the ones where we'll have Ask Her as a part of that. Ask for YYC. On that board, one of the things that our president had brought in at the time was to check in with everybody about capacity. And at first it was kind of like, we all sort of like we know each other and we understand that there's lots going on, but it really created space at the beginning of every meeting and there was no, it wasn't just about work. It wasn't just about board work. It was like, how are you feeling? What's going on in your life? What do you have capacity to do? Is there something that, you no longer have capacity to carry? And I think that really created a space for people to share as much as they needed to and felt comfortable doing so. But over time, it moved away from just, I'm really busy with my day job, so I'm not gonna be able to do so much at night, to like, hey, the political environment right now is really burdening me. I feel like I experienced some microaggressions today and it was awful, and I'm just not in a very good headspace. And as that started probably about a couple years ago, and I've seen that now extended into like my workplace. And I just think it's a really important way to set the tone of the organization, right? And it's also easy to know whether or not your leader, your organization is being genuine, because the more that you make space for that conversation, the easier it is to talk about, I'm very stressed out by X client or Y project, or this thing is happening right now, the protest. Like outside of my apartment in Ottawa, I was very clear a week ago, it's very hard for me to get work done right now because there are blaring horns outside my window. And just to even be able to say that, it sounds ridiculous, but when push comes to shove, I've been in places where I wouldn't even feel comfortable sharing that. I'd say I just have to find a way to put up with it and move on. So that's like, it's not just situational. It's also like, it was a really hard month because we're seeing a lot of white supremacists outside and it's weighing on me. And I need to think about that. I know it was like a really difficult week when we were discussing like a couple of years ago, some work in the Alberta legislature around bringing back conscience rights. And like, that was the space to have that open conversation. And like Elleen said, it's not necessarily about like gotcha moments or gossip, but it's about creating that safe space to share with each other. And in that way, you find allies amongst your coworkers, but you're also being very clear to your superiors about what you need, and like they're making that space for you. So I hope to see more of that kind of cultural shift, and that leaders, moving away from we need to perform and meet X metric and Y, client need, et cetera, and like, how is our team being supported well enough to do those things that are important to our company?
Yeah, it's almost like Connecting before content is really important, right? That connection and check in. Anna?
Well, I think both Elleen and Shifrah have touched on remarkable, incredible points. Elleen brought up, that safe space, and I know for myself, I've heard from so many folks when they say, I'm scared of saying the wrong thing. There's this fear. So because of that fear or that hesitancy to perhaps say the wrong thing or to know what is PC, what is politically correct, or whatever that fear is, they're not even going to bother starting, or they're not going to engage at all. And I think that's the wrong kind of mindset to approach this with, because the reality is that, for me, as a transgender woman, I'm not looking for perfection from my allies, because I realize that, the trans community, if we look at that as an umbrella term, we're not a monolith, right? So trans individuals, trans women, trans men, non-binary, two-spirit, gender diverse, however that takes its shape, we're not a monolith. We all face and we all have different aspects. Even though I'm a part of that umbrella community, I have learning to do within that. So, but that fear of perhaps saying the wrong thing, again, if you're coming from that genuine space, for me, if you're coming from that genuine space of wanting to learn and do better for yourself and others that you serve, especially if you're a business, then you should be able to come and sit down and be able to sit in that discomfort, and also recognize that not everyone's an advocate, right? So, just after watching this, don't go up to your classmates or your coworkers who may perhaps be within that community of marginalization and, start asking them tons of questions, because not everybody is an advocate. Some folks are just trying to go about living their lives. So find the right space to do so. But yeah, don't let fear of perfection stop you from starting to engage in the dialogue, or to start doing your own research on, hey, how can I come to this conversation genuinely and authentically?
I think that's a great point, because I think people do get stuck at that point quite often. Eric, you had a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about that safe space a little bit, and just like personal experiences that I've had around that, and like even in my own experience in the corporate world, you encounter situations of like blatantly sexist comments, and I find, as like a cisgender straight white man, sometimes those comments are made with other cisgender straight white men in the room, because they feel like they can say those things and maybe get away with it. And the fear that I've had in those moments is that I'm not always the most senior person in the room. I'm not always the person with the most amount of power. I'm several rungs down the ladder when it comes to the person that can sort of like stand up and be like, hey, that's not right. And it's what I've actually found is especially in the workplace, is that sort of like anonymous reporting portals or ways to take action on things outside of that situation has been pretty valuable for me, and that's something that I've done a couple times in like some really blatant situations, and it's been really helpful. And so even if in the moment it can feel scary or feel uncomfortable to sort of stand up and interject, I would hope that there's other ways to call out that behavior that might feel a bit more safe to you. And I like, a lot of organizations are, highly masculine, patriarchal places. And along with that comes status and power, and the desire for status and power. And, a lot of men can feel like they need to fall in line with sort of like, what that status and power is telling them to do if they want to succeed. And going against that can feel really scary to say, no, I'm not going to go along with this. And I might have to therefore sacrifice my advancement into status and power. But there's ways to do it. And sometimes those happen after the fact, and circling back and finding the right avenue that feels safe. So yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, and that's oftentimes we're in classes as students who are, going on to summer internship programs or something like that, and they see things like this. I've heard the stories, right? And it's kind of goes back to maybe Eileen's original statement, which is, understanding your positionality in those moments can be important, but also presents its own challenges, right? All right. So you talked about the challenges of swimming upstream for men in the workplace, Eric. So we'll ask you, knowing that a significant portion of the inequity we see in the workplace is rooted in some of those work interruptions that we have, like the transition to parenthood and going on maternity or parental leave. What role do men play in combating some of that, both at work and at home?
Yeah, so I mean, I could go on for quite a long time about this topic. It's something that I'm very, very passionate about. As a father of two young kids, I'm in my son's nursery right now because this was the quietest room in the house. I believe really heavily in investing in your, as a man in a heterosexual relationship, investing in your ability to be a caregiver, a supporter to your partner, and a household manager as well. And so before we were deciding to have children, I was just looking around to be like, what does a new father do in the corporate world? Like, how do they show up? And I saw a lot of examples of more senior men that when they became fathers, they actually worked even harder. They, only took a couple weeks off when the child was born. They doubled down on their career because there was now an increased urgency for them to be the breadwinner and make up for two salaries as opposed to just their own salary and splitting that with their partner. And so I actually sat down with some of these more senior men, and I had a bunch of coffee chats, and I was like, hey, I'm going to be a new father soon, hopefully, and I want to take a lot of parental leave because I've heard that parental leave is a great way to sort of balance out that mental load at home. And I expected to hear, you get back to work and you do your duty as the breadwinner. That was not at all what I heard. I heard the exact opposite, actually, of these men that were in their 40s and 50s and 60s saying to me, oh, I wish I would have taken more time when our child was born. I wish I had the ability to really invest in my life outside of the workplace a little bit more. And I think that there's a younger generation of men now that are more conscious of gender equality and things like the mental load, like running a household and planning out groceries and planning out your kids' doctor's visits and things like that typically women have taken on a lot more of, throughout history. And we're realizing that men need to share more of that mental load. And I think what we're going to see is a lot more men participating more authentically in those early years around parental leave. And then it's not just taking parental leave when your child is born, it's also setting barriers around your hours at work as well. And so that's been a really interesting thing for me, and something that I'm trying to manage through right now is that historically, in a heterosexual relationship, there is sort of like roles that each parent played. From a gender perspective, the man was typically the breadwinner, and the woman was typically the caregiver and household manager. And obviously there's lots of problems that go along with that to do with power and status and economic independence and things like that. And so it's right that we should be breaking down those established roles. But now we're living in this world where people want to play all three of the roles at the same time. So breadwinner, caregiver, household manager, and the negotiation and the figuring out of who does what at which time is extremely difficult, and actually leads, I think, to a lot of conflict and communication that needs to happen to make that work. And the fact of the matter is that our workplaces are not set up to be multiple things. Our workplaces are set up to be the breadwinner, to work 50, 60 hours a week, to be, depending on your job, maybe traveling more often, and then have someone that supports outside of the workplace at home. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, it's just a really interesting time, I think, that as a new generation moves up into more senior positions, what is work going to look like in the future? Yeah. I think that the pandemic has has made us realize that we need to play all these roles at the same time, right? And work needs to adapt to that.
Yeah.
And so, and men, I think, are the primary change agent in that. I think women had traditionally been playing all these roles for so long, and now it's men. It's on us to say, okay, now we're going to fully participate. Now we're going to join you in this journey. And so the biggest amount of change needs to start with traditionally men, I think.
Yeah, there's a researcher named Arlie Hochschild who says that true equality will not happen until men contribute to the unpaid household labor in the same way women are contributing to the paid workplace labor, right? Shifrah?
Oh, Eric, like everything you said is very, very, it's resonating deep in my soul. So my partner and I have been together for 5 years. He's a cishet dude. And while like I belong to the queer community, I fell in love with a man. I don't know why, but here we are. And it was, when we first were together, I just knew I was in a point in my life where I had sort of moved along from more of that traditional gender role split. I was learning more about my own independence and trying to figure out my cultural identity as part of like an immigrant diaspora. And I told myself, I was like, I do not want to enter in another relationship until I have decided exactly what I want and I can be very clear about communicating this. And I decided that in terms of reference for our relationship, day one was going to be a good choice. And people, will like really give me the side eye or laugh when I first mention this. But then after, you explain it, I've had so many people come back to me and say like, can I get a template? Because it was really important to me. Like I wanted to lay everything on the table and say, this is what I want out of my life. This is what I expect out of my relationship with you. Should we move forward? If you don't agree, that's fine. That's okay. I respect your right to say no, and I respect your right to walk away, but like, I'm not willing to compromise on what I wanted. Mm-hmm. And, and then we also, of course, have like sort of a structured period of time in which we revisit this and make sure that we're both okay with how things are going. I mean, it's like 5 years in, we're doing all right. But one of the things that I had said early on was that I was not willing to compromise my career. And I said, I'm very, very, very interested in like working. I have a plan, obviously that's gone to the wind now, but I was super clear about my expectations. I laid out this plan. And I think one of the most like refreshing things and comforting things that he said back to me in that moment was like, you bring home the bacon, like I'm happy to cook it. And,
Mm-hmm.
It's like a flippant statement, whatever. But I think to me, it signaled that there was not an interest in like trying to fight over this like career / like gender role expression of like being a breadwinner, that insecurity wasn't going to play into a part of this relationship because I'd seen that in the past. And I also really appreciate you saying like in a heterosexual relationship, because we're at a point in our lives now where things are not so clear cut, right? Like we have queer relationships, we have polyamorous relationships, we have relationships with people who don't fall into these like neat little gender binaries. And so it's so important when we're talking about these policies to make them broadly applicable. And like in theory, they are, sure, but are the staff at your workplace in a mental state of mind to understand that like these needs are going to look different for different people? And there's some flexibility around offering that, right? Or supporting people who are choosing to take that in different ways. Even when it comes to like workplace boundaries, like, are you able to create some of that in a way that's like open and transparent with your workplace? Like, I'm just going to cut off at 5 because I promised my family that I would be home and I would cook dinner. Not like I'm going to cut off at 5 and then make some excuse that would make it weird for somebody to question. Like, just being very transparent about the fact that you do really value your home life balance. I tend to say on that, but I really want to hear from other people too.
That makes me think of like 5 things too. Your amazing example takes me all the way back to what Elleen was saying about knowing yourself first, that you were very clear about what you needed and your thoughts be going into the relationship. And I think for new grads and students, understanding that kind of in a combination between what you've said and Eric said, finding a partner who shares your long-term values and also is part of what can make that successful for individuals, right? So I'm never going to say there's one way to divide household labor and careers and all of that. It's important that the couple agrees and how they are going to share, and that works best for them. But I think that being really explicit and thoughtful and clear and having those conversations up front, super important, right? That increases the odds for success. And then the other point that you were making, when we talk about, like with Eric chatting about that transition to parenthood and taking parental leave, and then your point on the gender and sexual diversity that we see in our spaces now, is that our workplaces have a lot of work to do to make sure that they're meeting the needs of all genders, not just women and men in their workplaces, and making sure, because the path to parenthood is, for some, it's, I'm going to carry my own child, and for others it's surrogacy and adoption, for others it's, IVF or something else. So we really need to be thinking around gender equity outside the gender binary, and making sure that a lot of those parental leave or maternity leave policies are kind of degendered. In fact, all of our policies should be degendered, but really thinking about where they go. Okay, I'm going to, I've got a question for Anna, and it kind of steps right into this. So we know that allies can be individuals, they can be your employers, they can be institutions. And we know that, unfortunately, often the people who are being put are often in the positions of being a change agent are actually those who are historically excluded. How do we demand more of our allies on the path to gender equity?
Well, to start with, you have to take a moment and look around at the tables of influence or power that you may have, or the privilege that you have, and ask yourself who's not there. Mm-hmm. And begin working towards bringing those individuals who are not there to that table, whatever that table looks like, whether that's the boardroom table, whether that's the cabinet room table, whether that's the kitchen table, whatever table that is, building a bigger table and inviting more folks to come and take space. Because that's the other thing. It's one thing to reach out and extend a hand and tokenize an individual in these positions. But mm-hmm. It's another thing to say, I value you. I need your voice. I need your expertise. I need you as an individual to come and bring yourself and everything that you bring, your lived experience, your qualifications, who you are. I want you to sit at this table, and I'm going to give you space to let that shine and let that come through. Not, I'm going to give you a space at the table and just sit there and look pretty and be decorative and be ornamental so that I can check a box, so that I can, look good to shareholders, so that I can look good to consumers. No, you need to invite those people to take up that space at that table. And in terms of being, whether you're an employer or whether it's a school or whether it's a government, I have begun saying for myself as a trans woman, symbols of visibility are important. So for me, walking downtown Calgary, seeing the crosswalk, whether it's the Pride crosswalk or the transgender flag crosswalk, or seeing the Pride flag raised, that's fantastic. What happens when that crosswalk gets paid over? What happens when that flag comes down? Where are the policies? Because when that flag comes down and the sun rises on the dawn of a new day, if I still can't go and get my medication from a pharmacist without facing transphobia, or I can't even begin to access equitable quality healthcare to begin with, we've got a problem. And it doesn't matter how many flags you raise or how many crosswalks you paint, that's not going to change it. So you need to ensure that the policy and the tangible action that you're putting forward is actually in line with these symbols or these moments, these cultural moments of visibility that you are putting forward, whether you're a government, whether you're a school, whether you're a workplace.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It makes me think of 100 things. I think I think Elleen has something she wants to say on this. I could see that you had something you wanted to say. Go ahead and share.
Thank you, Anna, for sharing that. I mean, that just, every time I hear about, the flags being raised and the sidewalks painted, it just, I'm reminded of, the subtle changes that are actually happening now within the city of Calgary, but with Mount Royal University too. I find that people are being awakened now. I mean, I think they were listening, but now they're fully awake and they're saying, okay, what can we do to support our people, our Indigenous, all community members, so that we feel valued, so that we're important. Like, we have something to say. We need to be at the table. We need to be sharing our experiences, because we have a lot of that experience, but also the knowledge that we need to carry forward for other agencies, for policy, in order for it to be effective. If we're not at the table, nothing will happen. There will be no change, and it's going to stay the same way as it is, within the environment. But I think, everybody here on the panel has really good ideas and values that are really being sought out now. And I think leadership is finally listening, and they're trying to take action. It's going to take some time, but I think they're finally at that point where now is the time for change. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Yes, so celebrate that. And I think and I'll take Anna, I'll take your comment and kind of shift the context, and then I want to hear your thoughts on it. But I think we have like the flag waving kind of performative allyship we often see. And then there are companies that take it a step further, and they actually have policies in place that are supportive and things like that. But then one step further is also, you can have the policies. In my own work on parental leave, I know that policies can be in place. They can be legislated to support dad's use of them, but they might not use it because they fear implications on their career or consequences on their career. Or even work from home policies used to people not use them because they were concerned that it might not look good to management or something. So we have to have the visible allyship needs to be there. The policies need to be in place, but then the culture needs to support it too. So I love the idea that you were saying, a seat at the table. But I think that when individuals are at the table, they have to be contributing members. That culture of inclusion has to be there.
Yes, absolutely. And in terms of, I was going to say, was there a question there? Or was that a statement? But no, you're 100% right. In terms of that, yes. I mean, I know for myself, you play the game, right? You play the game to get to a space where you can now start pushing back, right? Where you can start challenging. You have to play the game to get ahead, and then you can start looking at it. But again, I can't change the culture. The people who are marginalized or are facing some kind of barrier, it's not necessarily up to. This is where allyship comes in. We need, oftentimes, like I say, in regards to my own, barriers that I face, it's my allies that I actually need to depend on when I'm not in the room, to stand up and say, hey, this is what we need. This is the action that we need to take. And as a leader in whatever it is, whether it's politics, whether it's business, whether it's education, if you're a leader in any case, whatever that looks like, you need to model the behavior that you want to see emulated. So if you are a company and you want this culture shift, your leadership needs to demonstrate that. If you want to see policy changed and you're in government, well, then your leader better be demonstrating that, because if they don't, again, it trickles down. So if you don't have that being emulated by the leaders who are in these positions, then me being a trans woman trying to, break down the door, it's not going to happen. That's where allyship comes in and goes from just being performative and flag waving and actually starts to make tangible, meaningful change that is needed.
Yeah. Leadership has to live what they're asking, or the culture that they're trying to develop. Shifrah?
Yeah, I kind of like, I held myself back from mentioning this earlier because I did not want to make this about cishet white men. But I'm just like all the things that Eileen and Anna and Eric have mentioned around, you know, policy change and leadership, and not, you know, we need change from people who have those positions of power in order for this to really go anywhere. I just like, I think about the fact that I've been very, very privileged in my life, I think, to have people who belong to like the dominant group, you know, the group with more power, be very open to conversations around these kinds of changes with me when I have worked for them. And in just thinking back to when Eric said, like, I went to my superiors and I was talking to them about parental leave, and they said, you know, I wish I had done that. Like, a lot of the time things don't change because people are simply not having the conversation. And I will be the first to admit that, like, that safety does not exist for everybody, and there is definitely a risk in doing so. But if you do see somebody in a position of power who is willing to have a conversation or has indicated that they are really seeking to understand and learn and do more, you know, I think trying to build a relationship there, if there is one possible, and you feel safe doing so, is really important, because like, you are now able to learn from somebody who might be able to sort of, you know, lend their privilege to you when you want to challenge something, and then help you pursue that forward. But also, like, I found that people who are willing to do that are also willing to learn. So if they've been doing something that hasn't been working, and you know, you approach that conversation, you say, hey, like, this is, you claim to be an ally. I feel like this isn't really helpful behavior. I found that people who are willing to do the work are also willing to shift the way that they do the work. And it's really important to seek those relationships. And I think like a good way to find that without sometimes compromising yourself or feeling like you're putting yourself at risk is to observe folks and see, you know, the types of conversations that they're having in the public space, the way that they model behavior. When I was working at the city, I was working for Councillor Craw before my current role. And, you know, one thing I really appreciated was seeing his kid around. We, like, the office was just kind of, it was like a collective, you know, I was never pressured to be a part of that. Like, we are a village helping with the children, but like, that was really encouraging to see. You know, conversations in the public realm, even when they felt like they were compromising, was really encouraging to see, because I felt like I could have the safe space to say what I needed. Even currently, when, like, we're in a remote work environment right now, so we have meetings, you know, 3 times a week with my current company. It's really encouraging to see, like, partners sit there with their kids on their lap, or message and say, hey, I can't come today because, like, I just had a really rough morning with my kids and I'm going to focus on that. Like, just having that out there allows you to feel comfortable to raise things, to have those conversations.
Yeah. Thank you. Eric?
I just wanted to build on that comment really quick. And so, as a member of the cishet white dude club, the way that I had good luck with having those conversations with leaders that identify in the same way that I do is actually coming at it from a position of, like, empathy for their situation, and like the man boxes and the patriarchy and masculinity, restrictive masculinity that they live in as well. And the fact, like, a great example of that is, like, you know, kids would be invisible if you were on a business call previously, and now kids you're allowed to sort of express your family role and your parental role more freely, I think, in the workplace. And that, to me, is a really great example of, like, the workplace itself being really restrictive around how people are allowed to show up, and how that's becoming more open now. And that restrictiveness applies to everyone that participates in the workplace. And I'm not making a judgment call on who has it worse or anything like that. I'm just saying that, like, I've had really good luck to be like, hey, like, here are some ways that maybe you've decided to show up that have helped you succeed, but have also kind of sucked for you too. And then once you open that conversation, I found that the ability to empathize with others' experiences, and the ability to take a more like humility-based approach to their allyship has been really great. And so, yeah, I just wanted to add that on.
I think it's one of the areas that has been a challenge, right? So if men, historically, parenthood for fathers in the workplace has been invisible. So the assumption is that women are the carers and that men are kind of secondary. And so we need to create workplaces where fatherhood is visible so that we can make room for women and that we can balance those responsibilities, right? And then Shifrah, your comments made me think too. I always try to, everyone makes mistakes and we need that feedback. And I try to see feedback as a gift, that the person providing me with that feedback actually thinks I'm kind of worthy to hear it, and that believes that I have the intention that I will, change my behavior and hear that and learn from it. And so I've tried to reframe it. So, connecting that to Anna's comment around being afraid to start, I think reframing how we see feedback instead of scary and like, oh, I messed up, into I am going to take that on board, and yes, I can change that, and that was a gift for me going forward, and I can change my behavior as a result. This has been an amazing conversation. I feel like this is conversation one of like probably 6 that's actually needed. So maybe we'll revisit that for next year. But I appreciate everyone's time, and thank you for being a part of Mount Royal University's Faculty of Business and Communication International Women's Day. I feel like we've had this very rich, diverse conversation around allyship and gender. And I just thank you guys so much for sharing your experience and thoughts with students and recent alumni.